And there's a couple of really big things with hydrogen that make it interesting, and one of those things will actually be hydrogen cars. But we'll start off with how it works and where we get it, which this one becomes really important because there's no natural sources of hydrogen. One of the things that often comes up is like, oh, hydrogen fuel, it's going to be clean and it's going to be wonderful. But the weird part about it is that you can't mine hydrogen. So you can't go and dig it out of the ground, and you can't get it from the air or anything like that. So you can get it from methane. So that's actually the most common place it comes from. What's also interesting about that then is that it is still producing carbon dioxide. So the most common way that we get methane in the United States is by using methane. So you still have the same general issues that you have with natural gas. You can also get it from coal, also an option. You can also do it from the electrolysis of water or from thermal splitting. So if you'll remember, thermal splitting was where you just heat water up really, really hot, which will get you hydrogen gas, as well as oxygen gas. That's also how we got the explosions at the various nuclear power plants. If we're talking about the electrolysis of water, realize that this takes energy. So you can use this, but usually this is another one of those games where you can't just get hydrogen gas magically. You have to put in energy to go ahead and split the water. So it's, again, not something that just happens magically. But you can't. But plants do this all the time, where they take water and they split it. So in plants, you guys may have seen this before, sort of notion of using photosynthesis, but usually what you see in plants is this production of a sugar, whereas, but the production of the sugar does involve splitting water. So plants do split water, but they use that hydrogen to go into sugar, but they can do that. Thermal splitting is the one where, again, you just heat it up really quickly and really hot, but it's not very efficient. So the question is, how does hydrogen fuel work?
Here, which should be quite fun.
So hydrogen fuel cells will convert this energy directly into electricity without the explosions. So what we're going to have is a fuel cell. And I'm actually going to show you an animated version of this. So that's what this plugin is down here. But basically you're going to have fuel going in, which will be our hydrogen gas. You're also going to have an intake of air. And so when the air comes in, you mostly need the oxygen from that. And what you're going to get out of it is water. And then you're going to need this membrane in between to let everything play with each other. You're going to get electric current out the other side. So if we take a look at what this looks like in motion, so again, you're seeing everything on that molecular or atomic level, but basically the combining of hydrogen and oxygen will produce electricity because there are electrons being exchanged in there. So this is the reason why everybody is excited oftentimes about hydrogen fuel, is because when you burn hydrogen fuel, what you get out of it is just water. So out of all the possibilities is you just get water out the other side. Notice it does need oxygen, but oftentimes those use an intake of air for it to get the oxygen. They actually do use hydrogen fuel cells on the space station, and you need to carry the oxygen with you if you're going to use it somewhere else. So hydrogen in cars is where people often get excited. The nice thing is that there's no sulfur emissions, there's no particulates, there's no carbon dioxide. So there's lots of good things with having cars run on hydrogen, a lot less pollution overall. So with hydrogen cars, those estimates have gone down. So durability has gone up. The hardest thing, though, is the infrastructure. So we do actually have hydrogen cars on the roads. So there is actually a Toyota Mirai. It's actually on the roads already. It's a thing. You can lease one. No, don't know my location. But this is something that it does. It exists. So you can lease them apparently for $349, at least in 2019. And you can click and drag, and isn't it shiny? Now, there's also the Honda Clarity, which you can also now lease. So you do have two different options of hydrogen fuel cars. So these things do exist. They're on the roads. Are already hydrogen stations in California. So if we take a look at the station map in California, you can see all of these potential stations. So green ones are ones that already exist. And then the yellow ones are ones that are in development. Purple, which I don't see any of immediately, are ones that are are proposed. So this website is one that you can go to kind of see where we are. But if you'll notice, it's just California. So you can kind of scroll out to see the entire US, and it's California. So these work great for going in cities, and they now have enough hydrogen fuel stations that you could go between San Diego to Sacramento, so that'll work. But you still can't get to Vegas and back. So these do have limits, but good for commuting cars. And definitely when you think about the amount of pollution in the air and the smog of LA, a really good solution potentially for Los Angeles. What was interesting is that you can dig up old articles, say from 2011, where it claimed that we should have hydrogen cars from 3 different dealers by 2015. We didn't quite make it, but it's always kind of interesting to look at what happens. In general, when you look at hydrogen, so one of the interesting things is that hydrogen is both explosive as well as flammable. So this notion of deflagration is flammability, and detonation is when you actually get a shock wave out of it. So just realize that part of the reason why everyone worries so much about hydrogen is because it is actually explosive as well as flammable. When you talk about the Hindenburg, though, Hindenburg was actually just the flammability and the flame speed. If you don't know what the Hindenburg disaster is, go ahead and look it up. But there's a reason why airships and blimps are not necessarily a big thing. One of the other things, though, speaking of the Hindenburg, that you should have noticed from the video that we showed earlier with this hydrogen balloon is these hydrogen balloons, you hopefully noticed, they all float in the air. So there was all of this deal where they were tying them down, and there's a weight, and they're all being suspended in the air. And this is because, like helium, hydrogen is lighter than air. So hydrogen will float. So just one of those other things, part of the reason why hydrogen is a big deal to make sure you keep it and have a way to hold on to it is because it'll just float away. It's less dense than the air around it. So as far as transporting hydrogen, since you have this notion of being lighter than air, usually compress it down. You can get it into a liquid. And pipelines are technically an option, but because you have to get it so cold to make it a liquid or be under such high pressure, pipelines are just not the best option. So usually they are done with fuel tanks. And there's just other different there's different articles that have come out over the years about pros and cons, depending. When you look at hydrogen cars versus electric cars, things get interesting. So when you look at things like the Toyota Mirai, there actually used to be, this is the hydrogen car, there used to be actual numbers for it. They keep leasing them though, so they're harder to find these numbers for them anyway. And then there's Teslas, which depending on which one you're looking at can be either more expensive or less expensive. Nissan Leaf, also relatively cheap. So you've got a lot of interesting options for cars. And a lot of times what will happen is the technology that we know better is the one we tend to stick with. So hybrids have been out for quite a while. So everybody's gotten very accustomed to the notion of hybrids. And electric cars hit the market before hydrogen cars. So you have electric cars still as having this like big emphasis behind them. This is a fun article that if you guys want to look into it, um, has this comparison between electric cars and hydrogen cars about where the pollution would really come from. So it's definitely a fun article, which I encourage you guys to read. As far as electric versus gasoline, the tricky part with electric cars is going to be what other pollutants are going to come in from things like the battery. And realize that electric cars are still going to be fueled by electricity, which often, that electricity is often being made from fossil fuels. So part of what that article on the previous slide looks at is the fact that since electric cars are being run on electricity, and electricity is often from fossil fuels, this carbon dioxide game doesn't actually win out. Pollutants overall, it does, but you're still having whatever those problems are. So back to hydrogen. One of the other interesting options for hydrogen that does exist in real life is this thing called an artificial leaf. So what this is a membrane that when sunlight comes into it, it will actually go ahead and produce hydrogen and oxygen gas. The cool thing about it is actually a self-repairing membrane and it's pretty hardy. And the water you put in it doesn't have to be that pure. So it actually works really well under a variety of different conditions and it's actually about ready for the market. So the cool thing is it's cheap, but it's still more expensive than hydrogen from industrial sources. So getting hydrogen from methane, still cheaper. And gasoline, still cheaper. But it's got really interesting potentials for it. So you can combine this technology with bacteria to produce other fuels. So since we have this ability for the artificial leaf and we have the ability to make hydrogen, the hard thing though is that in the US we don't have a lot of infrastructure. So we looked at that map of hydrogen plants and we can look at another map. So again, lots of places in Southern California and some in the middle of California, but that's all. Whereas if you look at a map of just regular gas stations around just the Dallas area, there's gas stations almost at every corner. So part of the main problem with hydrogen becomes the infrastructure. Where are these places going to be? How are you going to get hydrogen when we already have gasoline everywhere? And this is the main problem with the artificial leaf is it's ready to go to market, but basically the US has already invested so much money in gasoline that it's just not really going to take off very well. But there is a market for it. So the question is, where might this happen? So this is a great question for me to ask you guys on the final, by the way. So this is one where you can pause the video and think about it if you'd like. But when you think about this, realize that it's going to thrive basically in places that don't already have the infrastructure in place. So either developing countries or countries that still have a really large rural population. So they were actually looking at putting the artificial leaf and hydrogen fuel stations in places like India, where there still is a very rural population. I realize that there are some parts of India that's got very densely populated areas, but there's still some places that don't have as much infrastructure, and that's where they're looking, are places that will still be building these things up. Now, interesting thing, there are a few hydrogen fueling stations, even in Texas, for specialized equipment, but where might you actually need that to be? And this down here is a bit of a hint. It's actually for forklifts. So when you think about it, you often need forklifts to be indoors where they might be in buildings and they might also be dealing with food supply. So you don't want the smell of gasoline. Forklifts can also run off of batteries, but this is one of the interesting places where you can also find hydrogen-powered vehicles also being used.